A few months ago, I started doing something a little unusual. Before working through any problem, creative, personal, or professional, I'd open a conversation with an AI first. Not to get answers, not to save time, just to think out loud with something that could push back. What happened next was strange. The AI wasn't telling me what to think, but the act of putting my thoughts into words for it, actually articulating them, was changing how I thought. The questions it asked in return made me realize I'd been quietly skipping steps in my own reasoning for years, assuming things I'd never examined, glossing over the parts I didn't fully understand. Most of us never notice those gaps because nothing ever asks us to fill them. There's a long history of humans reaching outside their own heads to think better. Journals, diagrams, late conversations with a friend who actually listens. The philosopher Andy Clark called us natural-born cyborgs, creatures who have always woven tools into their thinking, blurring the line between what's inside the skull and what's out in the world. When you write something down, it isn't just storage. The act of externalizing an idea forces a translation from vague and impressionistic into something with edges. And once it has edges, you can actually look at it. In that sense, every serious thinker has always had collaborators, paper, blackboards, the margins of other people's books. But this feels different, and not just incrementally different. A journal doesn't ask questions. A diagram doesn't notice when your framing is circular. A trusted friend gets tired, gets defensive, brings their own needs to the table. What I keep encountering is something else. A thought partner available at any moment, never fatigued, capable of holding an entire framework in working memory while you wander around in it. That's not a better pen. That might be something closer to what writing itself once was. When I'm stuck, I no longer just sit with the stuckness. I start talking. And something about the act of describing the problem begins loosening it before the AI even responds. Then it asks something, sometimes obvious, sometimes not, and I realize the thing I called a problem wasn't the actual problem. It was a symptom of something I hadn't named yet. That happens more than I expected. But here's where it gets more complicated. What if the friction is the point? Cognitive scientists talk about something called desirable difficulties, the counterintuitive finding that harder learning leaves deeper traces. Struggling to retrieve something makes it stickier than rereading it. Generating your own explanation, even an imperfect one, builds understanding in a way that receiving a clean answer doesn't. So the question isn't whether AI can think for you. You can decide it won't. The more unsettling version is subtler. Does having a patient, capable collaborator always available quietly erode the tolerance for sitting with confusion long enough to actually break through? I don't have a clean answer, but I've started noticing when I reach for the conversation before I've really stayed with the problem. There's a difference between using a tool to think better and using a tool to avoid the thinking altogether. The line between them isn't always obvious in the moment. Maybe the real question underneath all of this isn't what AI can do for your thinking. It's what kind of thinker do you want to become? The tool doesn't answer that. That one stays with you.
There's an old trick in software development. When you're stuck on a problem, really stuck, the kind where you've been staring at the same lines of code for an hour, you explain it out loud to a rubber duck, literally, a little plastic duck sitting on your desk. The idea is that the act of articulating the problem forces your brain to organize it. You start talking, and somewhere in the middle of explaining it, you hear yourself say the thing that's wrong. The duck never responds. That's not the point. It works, which is a strange thing to sit with. I've been thinking about why it works and what happens when the duck talks back. When we keep a thought inside our heads, it exists in a kind of compressed, half-formed state. We know what we mean, or we think we do, without ever fully unpacking it. Psychologists sometimes call this the illusion of explanatory depth. Ask someone how a zipper works, really works, and most people will discover mid-explanation that they have no idea. They had the shape of an understanding without the substance. We carry a lot of shapes around. Writing helps with this. Speaking helps more. Something about producing language, turning an idea into a sequence of actual words, forces a kind of precision that silent thinking doesn't require. You can't hand-wave in a sentence the way you can in a thought. But there's a ceiling to what the duck can do. It can prompt you to externalize. It can't ask you what you meant by that. That's the shift I keep coming back to. When I describe a stuck problem to an AI and it responds not with an answer, but with a question, something like, what are you actually trying to preserve here? Or what would change if you dropped that assumption? Something different happens than the rubber duck moment. It's not just that the thought got organized, it's that the thought got interrogated. And those are not the same thing. Organizing a thought makes it clearer. Interrogating it makes it honest. What surprises me is how often the question reveals that I've been solving the wrong problem, not a harder version of the right problem, a completely adjacent one that I drifted into without noticing. Like someone who spends an hour rearranging furniture when what the room actually needs is a different light. The rubber duck can't catch that. It doesn't know what the room was supposed to feel like. There's a version of this that goes deeper than productivity or problem solving. We spend a lot of our lives thinking in loops, returning to the same concerns, the same half-conclusions, the same stuck places, partly because we never find the right conditions to think them all the way through. The conditions being enough patience, no judgment, enough back and forth to actually get somewhere. Those conditions are harder to find than they sound. A good conversation is one of the rarest things, and most of us aren't having enough of them about the things that actually matter, not because we don't want to, but because the people around us are busy, or tired, or too close to the problem, or too far from it. So the thoughts stay compressed, the shapes stand in for understanding, and we move on. Maybe what the upgraded duck offers isn't intelligence exactly. Maybe it's just the right conditions, patience, availability, a question asked without an agenda that most of us have been quietly starved of for years. Not a solution, a surface to think against.
At some point, and I couldn't tell you exactly when, I got good at fooling myself. Not in any dramatic way, nothing worth confessing, just the quiet, ordinary kind of self-deception that happens when you've thought about something enough times that you stop actually thinking about it. You've rehearsed the shape of the conclusion so many times that it feels like understanding. The steps that led there? Somewhere along the way, you stopped checking them. There's a term researchers use, the illusion of explanatory depth. The basic finding is this: people consistently overestimate how well they understand things. Ask someone to explain how a toilet flushes or how a bicycle stays upright, and something uncomfortable happens mid-explanation. The understanding they were sure they had starts to thin out. The details aren't there. What felt like knowledge was really just familiarity, the shape of a thing without the substance. We do this with ideas too, with beliefs, with stories we tell about ourselves. What caught me off guard, what I didn't expect from using AI as a thinking partner, was how often it exposed this in me. Not in any confrontation, just through a question. A simple, patient question that assumed I could go deeper than I'd gone. And I'd start to answer and realize I couldn't. Not the way I thought I could. There's something specific that happens in those moments. It isn't embarrassment exactly. It's more like discovering a room in your own house that you thought you knew and realizing you've only ever seen it from the doorway. You assumed you knew what was in there. You'd glanced in enough times, but you'd never actually walked in and looked around. The skipped steps aren't random. That's the thing that keeps nagging at me. The gaps tend to cluster around the places we most want to be right, the beliefs that do the most work for us, the narratives that let us stay comfortable. We don't scrutinize those as closely for obvious reasons. Scrutiny has a cost. And most of the time, nothing forces us to pay it. Life moves fast. Conversations are short. There's always somewhere else to be. So the assumptions stay buried, and the reasoning built on top of them stays standing, and we get good at not noticing the foundation. What changes when you slow down long enough to actually trace your thinking back, step by step, premise by premise, is that the sloppy parts start to show. Not always dramatically. Sometimes it's just a word you've been using slightly wrong for years. Sometimes it's a belief you inherited rather than arrived at. Sometimes it's a conclusion that made sense in one context and quietly stopped making sense in another, and nobody updated it. These things accumulate. I'm not sure what to do with all of this, honestly. There's no clean takeaway, no three-step process for thinking better. What I do notice is that the willingness to be uncertain, to sit inside a question instead of reaching past it for the answer, is its own kind of skill. And like most skills, it atrophies if you don't use it. The skipped steps don't disappear just because you've gotten fast. They just become invisible. And invisible things are the ones that tend to trip you.
There's a certain kind of frustration that doesn't feel useful while you're in it. The kind where you're trying to understand something and it just won't click. You read the same paragraph 3 times. You stare at the problem. You walk away, come back, stare at it again. Nothing. It feels like waste, like spinning your wheels. But there's a growing body of research suggesting that this particular discomfort, the effortful, unresolved kind, might be exactly where learning actually happens. Cognitive scientists call them desirable difficulties. The idea is counterintuitive enough that it tends to stop people mid-sentence when they first hear it. Harder learning conditions, ones that slow you down, introduce obstacles, make retrieval feel like work, produce stronger, longer-lasting understanding than smooth, frictionless learning does. The struggle isn't a sign that something's wrong. In some cases, the struggle is the mechanism. Testing yourself is more effective than rereading. Spacing out practice until it feels slightly uncomfortable beats cramming. Generating your own explanation of something, even an imperfect one, even out loud to no one, builds a kind of understanding that receiving a clean, polished answer doesn't. Which raises an uncomfortable question for anyone who's been using AI to think more efficiently. Because efficiency is exactly what it offers: a patient thought partner, instant context, no friction by design. I use it anyway. I think the benefits are real, but something nags at me when I'm honest about it. The recognition that some portion of what I'm routing around might not have been inefficiency at all. It might have been the part that was making me smarter. There's a version of this that shows up in physical training. Muscles grow from resistance, not from ease. A workout that never challenges you isn't really a workout, it's just motion. The adaptation happens in response to the load, not in spite of it. Reduce the load entirely, and the adaptation stops. The brain isn't a muscle. That particular metaphor only goes so far, but the general principle seems to hold in ways that feel relevant here. Thinking that costs something tends to leave a deeper mark than thinking that doesn't. What I keep turning over is this. We're building tools that are extraordinarily good at reducing the cost of thinking, and we're doing it at the exact moment when most people already have very few reasons to think hard about anything. That combination is worth taking seriously. This isn't an argument against the tools, it's more of a question about how to use them and what to protect. Because not all friction is worth keeping. Some of it really is just waste, bureaucratic, arbitrary, the kind that wears you down without teaching you anything. But some friction is load-bearing. It's the resistance that produces the result. Removing it doesn't free you from a burden. It removes the thing that was building the capacity. Maybe the question isn't whether to use the tools. It's whether we're still choosing to do the hard version sometimes, not because we have to, but because we understand what it's for. Deliberately, knowingly, the way an athlete chooses to train without assistance even when assistance is available. Not out of nostalgia for difficulty. Because some things you can only build the hard way.
Most conversations have a hidden layer. Underneath whatever is actually being discussed, something else is happening. Someone is managing how they come across. Someone else is waiting for their turn to speak. There's a subtle negotiation happening around who's right, who sounds smart, who gets to feel good about themselves at the end. We don't talk about this much because it's mostly invisible, and because pointing it out tends to make people defensive, which kind of proves the point. But it shapes every conversation we have, often more than the content does. The first time I noticed something different about thinking out loud with an AI wasn't the quality of the responses, it was the absence of that layer. Nothing to manage, no status being negotiated, no subtle shift in the room when I said something half-formed or contradicted myself from 2 minutes ago. I could be uncertain out loud, fully, unguardedly uncertain, and nothing social happened because of it. That turned out to matter more than I expected. There's a specific kind of thinking that only happens when the stakes feel low enough. The half-baked idea you'd only say to someone you completely trust. The question you're embarrassed not to already know the answer to. The belief you're not sure you actually hold, you just want to say it out loud and see how it sounds. Most of us have very few places where that thinking is welcome. And without a place for it, a lot of it just doesn't happen. The thought stays compressed, half-formed, never quite examined because the conditions for examining it never arrived. What I'm still turning over is whether this is entirely good. Because the social friction in a real conversation isn't only obstacle. Some of it is information. When someone pushes back, not just asks a question, but actually resists, gets a little animated, tells you you're wrong with something at stake, that resistance carries weight that a patient, neutral response doesn't. Being challenged by someone who genuinely disagrees with you is a different experience than being challenged by something that has no position of its own, and I'm not sure the difference is trivial. There's also something about being truly heard by another person, someone with their own interior life and struggles, someone for whom your words land and mean something, that doesn't have a clean substitute. That's not a knock on the tool. It's just an honest accounting of what it is and what it isn't. Still, for the specific task of working something out, there's a strange freedom in thinking alongside something that has no ego in the outcome, no preference for one conclusion over another, no investment in being the one who got you there. It just stays with the question. And maybe that's a more unusual gift than it sounds. Think about how rare it is, even among the people who know you best, to have someone fully present with your problem, not subtly steering it, not filtering it through their own experience, not already drafting their response while you're still talking. Genuinely just there. I don't think that replaces human conversation. Nothing about this makes me want less of it. But it does make me notice, more than I used to, how much of what passes for thinking together is actually two people thinking separately in the same room, waiting for a gap, and how rarely we get the other kind. There's a particular quality of thought that seems to only show up uninvited. In the shower, on a long drive with no podcast running, somewhere in the middle of a walk where you stopped paying attention to where you were going. Nobody scheduled it, you weren't trying, and then something arrived. A connection you'd been missing, a sentence that finally said the thing, a question that reframed everything you thought you already understood. Most people know this experience. Fewer talk about what it actually requires. What it requires mostly is nothing. No input, no task, no conversation to manage or message to answer, just unstructured time and a mind with enough room to wander somewhere it hasn't been before. Neuroscientists call it the default mode network, the brain's activity when it isn't focused on anything in particular. For a long time, it was treated as the brain idling, wasted bandwidth. It isn't. The default mode turns out to be where a lot of the most interesting cognitive work happens. memory consolidation, imaginative simulation, the quiet background processing that eventually surfaces as an insight you can't quite explain the origin of. The shower thought isn't random. It's the result of something that needed space and finally got it. Which makes me wonder what we're doing to that space. Not just AI, everything. The ambient noise of a fully connected life, the reflex to fill any pause with a screen, the sense that unscheduled mental time is somehow laziness dressed up as rest. We have built an environment that is extraordinarily hostile to the conditions that produce this kind of thinking, and then we wonder why the insights feel harder to come by. And now there's something new in the mix, a thought partner that's genuinely useful, available the moment boredom starts, ready to engage the second the mind goes quiet. I like it. I reach for it. But I've started to notice the moments when I reach for it too fast, when the discomfort of not yet knowing something makes me want to fill the gap immediately rather than let it stay open long enough to become interesting. There's a version of solitude that isn't loneliness and isn't laziness. It's something more like a working condition, the state in which certain kinds of thinking become possible that aren't possible any other way. Darwin walked the same gravel path around his garden every day and called it his thinking place. Nietzsche said his best ideas came to him on long walks and that sitting still was a kind of betrayal of thought. Kafka wrote mostly at night, alone, when the apartment was finally quiet. These aren't romanticized eccentricities, they're descriptions of a practice, protecting the conditions under which certain thoughts could actually form. The question I keep returning to isn't whether to use the tools, it's whether there's still room in an ordinary day for the kind of thinking that can't be prompted or assisted or efficiently organized. The kind that needs you to be a little bored, a little lost, willing to not know something for longer than is comfortable. Because some thoughts won't come when called. They show up later, sideways, when you've stopped looking. And the only thing that seems to reliably prevent them is never leaving enough silence for them to land. Someone asked me a question once that I'm still thinking about. It wasn't a complicated question. It wasn't even particularly original. But nobody had ever asked it to me before in quite that way, at quite that moment. And something about it reached into a part of my thinking I hadn't visited in a long time. I didn't have an answer. I still don't, fully. But the question changed something. Not by pointing me toward a conclusion, by pointing me toward a room I didn't know I'd been avoiding. We talk a lot about the value of answers. Good information, correct data, the right solution delivered efficiently. That's mostly what we've built our tools around. The assumption that what we're missing is answers, and that the job is to supply them faster. But there's a growing suspicion in me that this gets the problem backwards. That what most of us are actually missing, more of the time, are better questions. Not questions as a rhetorical device, not the leading kind that already contain their answer, dressed up in a rising inflection. Real questions, the open, genuinely curious ones that don't know where they're going and don't pretend to. The kind that create more space than they fill. Those are surprisingly hard to come by. Think about the last time someone asked you something that made you stop. Not a trivia question, not a form field. Something that required you to reach somewhere you hadn't reached before and meant it when it waited for you to find what was there. For most people, that's a rare enough experience that they remember it. What I've found, unexpectedly, is that a well-prompted AI asks more of those questions than most conversations do. Not because it's smarter than the people in my life, but because it has no agenda about where the answer lands. It isn't quietly hoping you'll agree with it. It isn't already composing its follow-up while you're still thinking. It just asks, and then it waits. There's a concept in coaching called a powerful question, one that shifts perspective rather than seeking information, opens something rather than closes it. The best coaches spend years learning to ask them without flinching, without rushing to fill the silence that follows. Most of us never learn this at all. It isn't really taught, and daily life doesn't reward it. It rewards speed, decisiveness, having a take. Sitting with a question long enough for it to do real work feels, in most social contexts, like stalling. But the questions that have actually moved me, the ones I remember years later, were never the fast kind. They were the ones that arrived and then stayed, that I kept returning to at odd moments, finding new angles, new discomfort, new something. A question worth keeping is a different thing from a question worth answering. Maybe what we should be cultivating, as a practice, as a habit, as something deliberately protected, is a slightly higher tolerance for the unanswered, for sitting inside a question rather than moving through it, for noticing when an answer arrived too quickly and might have closed something that wasn't ready to close. The best questions don't point you somewhere. They make the territory larger. And sometimes larger is exactly what was needed, even when it didn't feel that way at the time.
A few weeks ago, I wrote something I was genuinely proud of. An idea I'd been circling for a while finally landed. The right framing, the right words, the thing I'd been trying to say for longer than I could easily admit. It felt like mine. It felt earned. And then I remembered that the conversation which unlocked it had happened with an AI. I sat with that for a while. The question that followed wasn't comfortable. Was that still my idea? Not in a legal sense. Nobody was disputing ownership. Something more personal than that, more philosophical. The kind of question that doesn't have an obvious answer, but has a way of staying in the room after you think you've left it. Originality has always been stranger than we pretend. When we trace the genealogy of any idea carefully enough, it rarely starts where we thought it did. The book that changed how you think, the conversation overheard at the wrong moment, the offhand comment a teacher made in a class you almost didn't take. Ideas arrive through contact. They come from somewhere, pass through you, get rearranged by whatever's already in there, and emerge as something you'd swear was yours. We call that thinking. We call it creativity. And most of the time, we don't interrogate the supply chain. But something about the AI version of this makes the question harder to ignore. Maybe because the transaction is more visible. You can scroll back and see exactly where the unlock happened, which question reframed the problem, which response sent you down the path that produced the thing. The inputs are logged, the collaboration is traceable in a way that a conversation with a friend or a paragraph from a book read years ago usually isn't. Visibility makes attribution feel more urgent, even when the underlying process might not be all that different. There's a concept in jazz called comping, the way a pianist or guitarist responds to a soloist in real time, supporting, suggesting, occasionally pushing back. The soloist gets the credit, their name is on the record, but anyone paying attention knows the conversation between them is where the music actually lives. Is the AI comping? Is that what's happening when a question it asks unlocks something I'd been stuck on for weeks? I keep landing in the same place, which isn't really a resolution, more of a reframe. Maybe the question of credit is less interesting than the question of process. What kind of thinking was required? What did I bring that couldn't have been prompted into existence without me? The specific obsessions, the particular angle, the years of noticing certain things and not others. The AI asked the question, but I had to have something worth asking about. Still, there's a version of intellectual honesty that wants to acknowledge the shape of how things actually happen, rather than the cleaner story we'd prefer to tell. That the lone thinker, working in isolation, producing ideas from pure individual effort, that was probably always more myth than reality. We just had better ways of keeping the collaborators invisible before. The notebook, the conversation, the book that sat on the shelf for 2 years before the right morning arrived. Maybe what's changed isn't the nature of creative thought. Maybe it's just that one of the collaborators is now harder to pretend wasn't there.
Every major tool we've ever built to extend human capability has come with the same quiet anxiety attached to it. Writing, when it was new, was treated with genuine suspicion. Socrates, who never wrote anything down himself, argued that it would weaken memory, that people would stop carrying knowledge inside them and start outsourcing it to marks on a page, that the mind, no longer required to hold things, would gradually lose the ability to. He wasn't entirely wrong, and he wasn't entirely right either. What writing did wasn't hollow out cognition, it transformed it, moved certain functions outward, storage, retrieval, the preservation of exact wording, and freed interior space for things that writing made possible in the first place. Longer arguments, more complex reasoning, ideas that could be refined over years instead of afternoons. The mind didn't shrink, it changed shape. We are probably somewhere inside a similar moment right now. The tools are different in kind, not just degree. An external memory that talks back, that notices patterns across everything you've said to it, that can hold a framework you've been building for months and hand it back to you intact when you return. The augmentation is real, and so is the question underneath it. What happens to the capacity you stop exercising? There's a reasonable version of this fear, and an unreasonable one. The unreasonable version imagines a clean replacement, that every function offloaded to a tool is a function permanently lost, that the mind is a fixed resource that depletes with disuse in some irreversible way. That's not quite how cognition works. Skills atrophy, yes, but they also rebuild, and the history of human tool use suggests we're more adaptive than the pessimistic version allows. The reasonable version is quieter and harder to dismiss. It isn't about losing capacity in the abstract, it's about losing the habit of reaching for it, the gradual narrowing of what we attempt without assistance, the slow recalibration of what feels hard versus what feels impossible, until things that were once merely effortful start to feel like they require a tool. That's a different kind of loss, harder to measure, easier to miss until it's already happened. What I keep returning to is a distinction that feels important. There's a difference between building a second mind and delegating the first. A second mind, a genuine extension, multiplies what you're capable of. It handles what you'd otherwise drop, holds what you'd otherwise forget, and gives you back cycles to use on things that actually require you. Delegating the first is something else. It's the slow transfer of authorship, not just the storage of thoughts, but the generation of them, not just the organization of ideas, but the having them. The line between those two things is not always obvious in practice, which might be the most honest thing to say about it. Maybe the question to keep asking, not once, but regularly as the tools get better and the habit deepens, is a simple one. When you sit down to think about something that matters, without opening anything, without prompting anything, without reaching for assistance, is there still something there? Something that moves on its own, follows its own thread, surprises you occasionally with where it ends up? If yes, whatever you're doing, it's probably working. If that space has gone quiet in a way that feels different from before, that might be worth paying attention to.